Welcome to Debutante Renegade. On today's show, LEGGO your ego. But first, if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. You can also hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video. On to today's topic, LEGGO your ego. How to let go of your ego, or beginning the process of having awareness over your ego. Now, we all have egos, right? And in some ways, our egos serve us. I wouldn't be here recording this podcast right now if it wasn't for my ego. However, our ego can also get us into some traps, and we can get stuck in some pretty dangerous ego mind loops, mind traps that causes a great deal of unhappiness and suffering. And this is going to be at least a two-part show. So part one is going to be identifying the ego. And then in part two, I'm going to talk about some common ego traps and how to have awareness of them. And really, the point of all this ego stuff is having awareness, because even though our ego tells us that the more external things about us, like the way we look, our socioeconomic background, our class, our gender, all these different things, our race, our religion, our familial background, the way we dress, all these things, our ego tells us that those things are our identity. But the truth is, none of those things are our identity. Our true identity is our pure presence of being, when we're truly present and in the moment. That is our truth. Our true sense is our consciousness, our presence and our consciousness. When we are conscious, when we are truly aware, our true consciousness, our true presence, that is the pure essence of our being. That is who we really are. We are not all these things that we identify with as the self. So those are all illusions. Those are illusory. Our job, whether we're a security guard or a banker or a real estate agent or an artist or a model, whatever these things are, if we identify as what our job is, that's something we do, but it's not who we are. And then if we lose that, maybe you get in some freak accident, you can no longer be a model, or something happens, or you lose your job as a banker, then our ego, it's harmed by this change. It can't handle this change because it has identified the self as being that thing. And when that condition changes, then this suffering ensues, because the ego needs to keep the status quo. It needs to keep all things the same. And that is just not the condition of life. The condition of life is that things are ever changing, always evolving. And so we can embrace the things that we do, the things that we love, the things that we are, but we need to understand that those things are ever changing. They will always change, and not identify as those things, as those externals, not identify ourselves as those externals. Our true identity is our consciousness and our presence. All those externals are all these fleeting egoic precepts, these things that we tell ourselves we are, but in fact, we aren't, And yes, you might actually be a security guard or whatever, but that's not your true self. You might not always be a security guard, therefore it's not your true self. It is this fleeting condition that you are currently in, and all these things are one's beauty, one's socioeconomic status, all these things. I mean, you could even argue gender. People change their genders these days, so gender itself might be fleeting for a person. It is this thing that we identify with, right? So anything that you identify with, your race, your religion, sure, you could argue that your race isn't changing, but the way that people perceive that might change and evolve over time. So therefore, you have to let go of this idea of how you imagine that to be perceived. because it's ever evolving. So we need to allow these things to be ever changing and ever evolving within us. And in order to do that, we need to be aware. We really need to be aware of what our ego self-identifies as. What are the things that we identify as? That is where our ego comes into play. And the ego, it can never have enough, right? Like I did an episode a couple weeks back on shopping addiction. And part of shopping addiction is, well, all of shopping addiction is ingrained in the ego. The ego believes that we need these things to be happy. And once we have those things, we'll be happy and fulfilled. But once we get them, then there's something else right around the corner that's begging for us to buy it in order for us to be happy. So it's like the goalpost is ever changing. And we might tell ourselves in whatever job we have, once we get that promotion or once we finish this assignment, then we're going to be happy. We're going to feel good. But that happens. We finish the assignment or we get the promotion, but then the goalpost moves. And once again, we're dissatisfied and we need this new condition to be met in order to find our happiness and our truth. And these are the types of vicious cycles that happen as a result of the ego. So becoming aware of how we identify and all these different self-identities that we have, becoming aware that these things are in fact illusory. They are not who we truly are. And every time we find ourselves starting to get caught in the identity of these things, if we can just shed a little light of consciousness and presence onto these ideas, onto these ideologies, then we might start to wake up from the spell that our ego has us under. And the ego, it inevitably causes suffering. The ego derives its sense of self from fleeting things. So this is how we recognize the ego. And it's truly unaware. It's unaware of the true source within. And recognizing form identification is the beginning of recognizing the ego and understanding it. One way that we can recognize our ego and become aware of it is to become aware of some of the things that we have, like say we have good looks, say we have money or a good job, or, say you have a gorgeous girlfriend, something like that. If you lost these things, would you still feel okay, or would you feel like you lost your sense of self? Now, I think most of us would feel like we lost part of ourself if we lost our job, if we lost our money, if we lost our looks, if we lost the person that we're dating. We would feel like we lost ourselves, right? That would bruise the ego terribly, because the ego wants to hold on to the sense of self that it knows. If you ask yourself if you lost those things, if you would be diminished, what does your mind say? Your mind probably tells you would be diminished. That's the ego. That is the ego acting. But in truth, you, in your truest sense of being, in your presence and your consciousness, you will actually be unchanged if you lost your looks, if you lost that gorgeous girlfriend, if you lost that job, if you lost your money. We're not saying that wouldn't be difficult. There wouldn't be challenges with all those things. But at the end of the day, you're still actually the same person you were before. You've only lost those external things that you've been identifying with. But you are still the same person that you were before. Your true self is just as true as it was before. It is the ego, it is the false sense of self that has diminished by losing those things. So the only way we can truly get to a full, true sense of self is to let go of these external ideas, these false ideas of self, because they will always change, and clinging to them will always let us down and feel like we are less of ourselves, or we are losing ourselves if we lose these things. It's interesting too, the way that the ego begins to manifest in childhood. We've all seen those children who are playing with the toy and somebody else takes the toy away from them, and the child screams and cries, "Ah, mine, mine!" The child's ego has identified that toy as belonging to him or her. That toy is his or hers, and to have it taken away is to take away a part of his or herself. And so that is the beginning of how we start to see the ego manifest itself into our lives. That's how the head trip starts to begin. But really, it's really all in the mind. The toy is not actually a part of you. It's not actually part of that child. And eventually the child is going to grow tired of that toy and let it go and not care about it anymore, right? So what does it matter that it was taken away for a moment? But in that moment, the ego is identifying with that toy, believing that it needs that toy to be itself. The ego is identification with form, primarily thought form. It might seem like pain, frustration, desire, all the different emotions we feel are caused by external circumstances, people, situations. But that's not true. They're actually mind created. If you see a desirable person or a desirable thing and feelings or thoughts of desire arise, that's actually a conditioned response. Desire and frustration are not just out there. They are conditioned responses. They are created by the mind that seeks forms, relationships, identities, etc. The ego seeks to enhance its ultimately false sense of self with an unconscious expectation that these things that we desire, that we seek, will fulfill. Desires and frustrations are not just out there, they're mind created. And the mind seeks forms, relationships, identity, security, pleasure, etc. And it does so in order to enhance its ultimately fictitious sense of self. And it creates an unconscious expectation that these external things will fulfill the self. Of course, none of that is true. It's very important to realize that you are not your mind. As often as you can, watch your mind. Be aware. The awareness, that is the awareness that is watching your mind, that is watching your thoughts, that is your true sense of self, not your mind. Your mind is an imposter that pretends to be you, and your conscious awareness of it is your true self. The more you can be aware of your thoughts and your feelings and see them almost as though you're an outside observer, the further you get from your ego. The more you can separate yourself from it and recognize when it's your ego and when it's your true self. So that's really what you can do to start to become aware of your ego, is to start to watch it. Watch this spewing stream of thoughts, ideas, and feelings that are just flooding through you at any given moment. Just pay attention to them. It's kind of like what meditation is, but that's one way that you can really start to recognize the ego. And when you start to recognize it, you can start to separate yourself from it, and you can start to free yourself from its clutches. So I'm going to talk about in the next episode a few common ego traps that we all get stuck in and ways that we can get ourselves out. So that's just a little intro into ego and consciousness and how they are not the same. How the ego is what separates us and our consciousness is what brings us mindful awareness and truth. I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear any of your thoughts surrounding ego awareness, your journey of letting go of your ego, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you'll check out the next one. I'm also going to link some info in the description box if you're really wanting to go on If you're really wanting to get better at recognizing your ego and overcoming it, there's a book by Eckhart Tolle called A New Earth that is incredibly helpful. It's done wonders for me and many people that I know. So I recommend that. I'll also link a couple of his videos down below. And you can even listen to the audiobook of that, A New Earth. I really like his voice. I find it really soothing, and it's nice if you're just driving. You can just listen to it and you'll get so much from it. It's really amazing. I feel like I need to listen to it again because it's been a long time. But yeah, I hope that helps. And I'd love to hear about your journeys, and check out the next video I'm going to do, which is going to be part 2 on the ego traps and how to get out of them. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Have a beautiful rest of your day.